I'm Dr. Ben Safranski, and welcome to session 4 of the Bible and the Eucharist. In the last video, I talked to you about what I like to call God's local presence in a couple of Old Testament stories. God really did walk with his people in a certain way, even before the incarnation in the Eucharist. He did this because he wanted to build a relationship with us, and we need to see someone face to face, feel like we are with them in order to build a relationship. We need to be close to them. In this video, we're going to continue to talk about the covenant between God and his people as it is ratified again in the ritual meal of the Passover. The Passover is also what the Last Supper, the Eucharist, fulfills. It is the most direct predecessor, you might say, of the Eucharist, and so to understand the Eucharist, you really need to understand the Passover. So the thing about covenant, both in the Old Testament and in human relationships generally, is that it is not a one and done thing. We can talk about the different covenants, plural, between God and humanity, but we can also talk about the one covenant that God is constantly renewing, adjusting, and re-offering to us. Throughout the Old Testament stories, God is constantly reminding the chosen people about their relationship with him. And that relationship is always being ratified again in light of the new circumstances that the chosen people find themselves in and the next steps of the purpose that God has for the chosen people. This is what the Exodus and the Passover are really about at their heart, is reminding the people about the relationship and taking them to the next stage of it. So first, let's bridge the history a little bit between Genesis and Exodus. In the second half of Genesis, we read the rest of the story of Abram and Sarai, that now Abraham and Sarah, and their family. God does fulfill his promise to give them many descendants. But after a couple of generations, those descendants end up needing to leave the promised land because of a famine. And they go to Egypt, where there is plenty of food and they are received well by the rulers. However, when the Pharaoh changes after some amount of time, the Jews end up as slaves. They stay slaves for about 400 years. And it's at the end of that period when God decides that the covenant needs to be renewed. The people need to be reminded that God is with them despite their hardship, and that there is a next phase in their relationship, a next step that they need to take to follow him. So the covenant will be renewed in a whole series of steps throughout the book of Exodus. And the Passover is the sacrifice and the ritual meal that will make that official. It is one of the major points of ratification or re-ratification of the covenant in the context of the whole Exodus. So let's look at how the Passover happens and what it really means. Now, in the last video, I spoke about the burning bush episode in chapter 3 of Exodus. After that episode, Moses and his brother Aaron tell Pharaoh to let the chosen people leave Egypt, but he refuses. So in response, we see the 10 plagues, which are wonders intended to display the power of the God of Israel. But because Pharaoh's heart is so hard, God continues to give these displays, continues to display greater and greater power until we come to the eve of the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. Now, this is a plague that we regularly misunderstand, and I want to talk about it because it is impossible to grasp the whole meaning of the Passover if we misunderstand the death of the firstborn. Now, our biggest problem is that we look at the death of the firstborn and the plagues in general as punishments intended to hurt the evil Egyptians. Now, I'm not going to tell you that there isn't an element of punishment in the plagues, But the main function of the plagues is actually to put on display the power and rights that the God of Israel has, not only over his own people, but over all of nature and ultimately over all human life. See, the major problem that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians have is that they think the God of Israel, or the God of the Hebrews, is only God over those people. Like most other nations, most other people in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, they believed that each group of people or each nation had their own God or gods that watched over them and only over them. So one of the things that God needs to do as part of this whole mission is show the Egyptians that he's actually the God of everyone, that he's not just the God of the Hebrews, that he's the God of the Egyptians and anyone else as well. So one thing you could do is go back and read about the plagues a little more carefully in Exodus chapters 7 through 11. I'm not going to go through that in detail here. But in chapter 7, when God foretells the plagues to Moses, he does call them great acts of judgment. But he also goes on to state the purpose of these acts. He says, quote, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord," unquote. So the plagues then build upon each other, sort of successively showing Pharaoh God's power over, let's say, impersonal nature, like the River Nile, over the sun, as well as over crops and livestock, which were crucial to their survival, over the human body, right? And then eventually the Pharaoh realizes that the God of Israel has power over all life itself when he takes the lives of the firstborn. So keep this in mind, and I'll come back to it again after we discuss the Passover meal in a little more detail. So the Passover meal itself and the ensuing escape from Egypt are described beginning in chapter 12. What is the Passover? Basically, it is a ritual meal that God commands the Israelites to eat before they escape from Egypt, but also tells them that they will eat every year after they take possession of the Promised Land as a memorial of what God did for them in bringing them out of Egypt. So where do we as Christians find the connections between the Passover and the Eucharist? Well, I can make 100 videos talking about all of the connections, but I'm just going to briefly mention a few of the major connections, centering around the main course of the Passover meal, the lamb. In chapter 12, the Jews are given these instructions, quote, "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month they shall take every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household," unquote. So every household in Israel needs to get a lamb, with the smaller houses sharing lambs between them. But what kind of lamb do they need to get? In verse 5, we read, quote, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old," unquote. And what are they to do with that lamb? Verse 6, we read, quote, "You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs in the evening," unquote. Okay, so let's get into a couple of things in these verses. First of all, Christians have always understood since the very beginning that the Passover lamb points us forward to Jesus, that the lamb itself is a foreshadowing of Jesus. We're told that already in the New Testament, both explicitly and in some more subtle ways. So when John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God," this is what he meant. And everyone knew that that's what he was talking about, that Jesus was the new Passover lamb. Jesus himself makes the connection explicit by offering the Last Supper as a Passover meal. And then one other example, when the book of Revelation depicts Jesus on the altar of heaven as the lamb who was slain, this is what is meant again. People see a lamb on an altar who has been killed. They know that this is a Passover lamb, and they also know that it's Jesus. So what are some of the characteristics of the lamb in Exodus that point us forward, right? We know that Christians have always done this, but then that still raises the question of why. Well, we just saw a little bit of it. The lamb is a male without blemish, as Jesus was the sinless man. The lamb was to be killed on the 14th day of the month, the same day according to the Jewish calendar on which Jesus was crucified. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, because they make that pretty clear. In addition, verse 6 says that the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel was to kill their lambs together. Now, when they're in Egypt, that probably just means killing their lambs at the same time. It's unlikely that all of the households would have been able to get together in the same place to kill their lambs. But later, when the Jews have the temple in Jerusalem, what this will mean is that all of the Passover lambs will be killed in the same place, in the courtyard of the temple. So essentially, the whole congregation of Israel is present when the Passover lambs are killed. Now, when Jesus was put to death, Israel was present. In essence, the whole congregation, represented by the Pharisees, the priests, and the people who called for and witnessed his execution at the time of Passover when Jerusalem was bursting with Jews. During the time of Passover, people would have been going in and out of Jerusalem constantly. And the fact that crucifixions take place on the public road outside the city gate means that, in a way, the whole congregation of Israel is a witness. One more thing, a little bit later in Exodus, a command will be recorded that you are not to break any of the bones of the lamb. A command which will be fulfilled at Jesus' crucifixion, according to the Gospel of John. So after the lamb is killed, what are the Israelites supposed to do next? Well, you probably know this. They take the blood of the lamb and they mark the door frames of their houses with it, right? They do this, the text says, so that the Lord will pass over their houses and not kill their firstborn. He won't kill the firstborn of the houses of Israel. Now, sort of in light of that, since very early days, we Christians have spoken of ourselves as being marked with the blood of the Lamb. And this is why. We think of ourselves, we talk about ourselves as being marked with the blood of the Lamb, like those door frames. Because when we are symbolically covered with the blood of Christ shed in the crucifixion, then we will be passed over by the angel of death as well. Not the angel of physical death, but will be passed over by spiritual death. So the Passover lamb is a foreshadowing of Christ. Got it. But what connects this specifically to the Eucharist? Well, the first thing is the fact that the lamb is not just killed, and its blood isn't just put on the doorpost, it is eaten as part of a ritual meal. Now, eating is already part of nearly every sacrifice in ancient Israel, and in fact, in the ancient world generally. Usually, when God asks you to destroy something good, like an animal, he doesn't ask you to do it just for the sake of destroying it, right? You sacrifice part of it to him, and you eat the rest. But the Passover lamb is the center of an especially solemn meal, and it's a meal that has a couple of unique rules. Chapter 12, verses 10 and 11 say this, quote, "And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." Unquote. So why are the Jews not allowed to have leftovers? Why can you not let anything remain until the next day? Well, partly this is because, as the following verse describes, this is a meal that is intended to prepare you for a journey. The Jews are going on a journey out of Egypt, and they need strength. They need to travel light, right? Who hasn't gone on a trip and told their kids, make sure you eat a good breakfast before we leave, right? We're not taking a bunch of snacks with us. I know I've done that many times, right? You need to fill yourself up so that you have strength for the road that you're going to be walking. And isn't that exactly what we seek in the Eucharist? Food to fill us, give us spiritual energy so that we can walk the hard road that God calls us to. I think the fact that they're not allowed leftovers is also because this is sacred food. This is food that has been dedicated to God through the sacrifice and serves a sacred and memorial purpose. It is not regular food, and you should not treat sacred food as if it's just last night's dinner. Notice what it says. It doesn't say in absolute terms that you have to eat every piece of the lamb. It says if there's any left over the next day, you must burn it, right? If this was just about, having strength for the journey and you stuffed yourself with lamb, then why wouldn't you just throw away the lamb the way you would throw away any other food? Or why wouldn't you stuff some, lamb in a Tupperware, put it in your backpack for walking through the desert? Because it's sacred and can't risk being shown disrespect or being desecrated, right, in those ways. And this is also part of the reason why, again, a little bit later in Exodus, they're told that when they celebrate the Passover sacrifice in the Promised Land later on, that no one outside of the nation of Israel can eat it. Only the Israelites can eat it as this sacred memorial, this sacred meal. Now, people who are ethnically foreign, if they are visitors in the Promised Land or they are slaves of the Israelites, they can eat it, but only if they've been circumcised. Basically, only if they've been initiated into the people of Israel. So the food itself has a sacred nature. So this is all, or most of it, is commonly understood, accepted by Christian theologians, commentators, the writers of the New Testament, and many of the faithful. I think a lot of us could make some of these connections ourselves. But now I want to talk about something that is a little bit less commonly understood by Christians. The fact that, like the death of Christ on the cross, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb is actually an atoning sacrifice. In other words, it is a sacrifice offered on behalf of someone who deserves death. It is a sacrifice of mercy. It is a way of taking a punishment or a consequence that the Israelites deserve and placing it onto an animal instead. Now, wait a second, I can hear you saying, it's the Egyptians who deserve to die because of all the bad things that they have done to God's innocent people. Well, sort of. It is true that God is bringing the plague on the Egyptians as a way of bringing about his plans for his chosen people. But the text of Exodus makes it clear that the Israelites belong to God, that their lives are essentially at the discretion of God in exactly the same way as the Egyptians. Now, to start with, did you ever wonder why the Israelites are commanded to take the blood of the lamb and put it on their doors? Now, just take a second. Don't know if you've ever thought about that. Try to imagine why. Why would this happen? Why the blood on the doors, right? Well, what are some possibilities? Do you think that God doesn't know where the Israelites live? Right? They're slaves, which means They almost certainly live in their own sections of the cities, at least the vast majority of them. So couldn't God have just shown the angel a map and said, hey, skip over the Jewish quarter? Right? And if God had some other reason for just marking the houses off, couldn't they have used paint or chalk or just something like that? Did they have to use the blood of the lamb to mark the doorposts? Well, the fact is that the blood is there because it represents that animal has been sacrificed to save the people living in that house, right? Their lives are in the hand of God, just like the Egyptians. Remember when I said that the plagues were about this kind of building demonstration of God's power and sovereignty over all of nature? Well, that demonstration culminates with his sovereignty over all human life. God, however, in this case, chooses to mark out the Israelites with the blood of a sacrificed lamb in order to show his mercy. And that's confirmed for us by a number of other things. I want to talk about two of them, basically. So if the plague was really all about killing the bad Egyptians, then you have to explain all the places in the text of Exodus where the Jewish people express gratitude for, quote, being spared, for being passed over or being spared the punishment. Right? Chapter 12, verse 27 says that God, quote, slew the Egyptians but spared our houses, unquote. Okay, so just think about that for a second. If you are innocent and the other person is guilty, do you consider yourself spared from punishment? Right? Let's just say you're in a bank and unfortunately that day somebody decides to come in and rob the bank, right? You're a totally innocent bystander. They push you around, they put you on the floor, they take your wallet. They're in the course of robbing the bank and the police show up. They arrest the robbers, and it's clear who the robbers are because they're wearing masks and they're carrying guns. Right? They arrest the robbers and you know that they're going to go to prison. Are you overwhelmed with gratitude for being spared a trip to prison? Of course not. Because as you know, punishment is for the guilty, not for the innocent. Now, occasionally in human affairs, we get confused about who is guilty and who is innocent, but God is in no danger of confusing the two. So really only someone who is guilty but is passed over for punishment could legitimately be called spared and would be thankful for it, right? Lastly, I want to go to chapter 13 and point out verses 11 to 16, where we read about something called the redemption of the firstborn, which is a part of the memorial celebration of the Passover after they go into the land of Canaan, after they go into the promised land and settle there. So in these verses, we read about the practice where the Israelites are told to either sacrifice or redeem every firstborn male of cattle, donkeys, and humans. All right, so cattle and donkeys, you either have to sacrifice the firstborn male to God, or you redeem it. You buy it back from God by sacrificing a lamb instead. All right, you let the lamb stand in for the cattle or the donkey. And part of the sense behind that is that cattle and donkeys are more valuable animals, often work animals for the Israelites that they could really use to have for years and years and years to pull their plows, to get milk from, all that kind of stuff. Lambs are smaller and their main function is providing food. So you're able to buy back something more valuable from God by sacrificing a lamb. Now humans, you never sacrifice, of course. You always redeem them. You redeem the firstborn male by offering a lamb in sacrifice. Now, why would that be associated with the Passover celebration, though? Well, verse 15 gives this explanation for the practice being associated with Passover. It says, quote, "For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of cattle. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem." Unquote. So the Israelites are told to buy back the lives of their firstborn from God by sacrificing lambs, just like they do at the Passover. Why? Because the lives of all of those firstborn, cattle, donkeys, humans, belong to God in the first place. He has a total and complete sovereign right over them. And yet in his mercy, right, first of all, his mercy for human life, he will not allow them to be sacrificed. You have to offer a lamb in redemption. And in his understanding of our condition and our needs, he allows us to redeem even cattle and donkeys, right, so that they can serve our needs. But they all belong to him. So what is the Passover for those of us who celebrate the Eucharist? Well, it's a ritual meal, and not just any ritual meal. It is the precursor to the Eucharistic celebration of the Last Supper. It depends on the sacrificial death of an innocent victim, a male without blemish. God's chosen people are not innocent. In fact, it is the death of the innocent victim that saves them from the death they deserve and provides them with the food they need to get started on an important journey. And why would God choose to spare them and provide for their journey? Well, as we've already talked about, not because they're better than anyone else, right? The chosen people are chosen because God loves them. They're not chosen because of how awesome they are, right? So not because they're better than anyone, but because they are chosen by him to further his purposes and fulfill his will on earth, to bring the Messiah and the saving truth to the nations. So that's the Passover. Does that all sound familiar? Right? Go back and think about it again. Does it sound anything like the Eucharist? A sacrifice, the sacrifice of an innocent victim, a male without blemish, in order to redeem God's chosen people so that they can go into the world and bring the Messiah and the truth of God to everyone, right? Does that sound like the Eucharist? Well, it should sound like the Eucharist. All right, that's it for this session. So next time we're going to continue in Exodus with some more important steps along their journey, more important things that happen in the renewal of the relationship, the renewal of the covenant between God and his people. Especially, we're going to talk about the manna in the desert. And we're also going to talk about the blood of the covenant and kind of where we get that phrase from. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe, hit the bell so that you get notifications, share this video with anyone you think might benefit from it. Most importantly, pray for me, and I will be praying for you. Peace.